The 18th birthday party was a performance of hollow luxury, a blur of expensive catering and scripted laughter echoing through the cedar-vaulted halls of our coastal estate. While my parents, Christopher and Jennifer, raised glasses of vintage champagne to a communal future, I felt like a glitch in their system. I watched them and my brother, Jordan, who was busy broadcasting the Vance family legacy to his thousands of digital followers. They weren't celebrating my transition into adulthood. They were salivating over the date they believed the keys would legally change hands. But as the grandfather clock in the foyer neared midnight, I wasn't the center of the frame. I was tucked away in the shadows of the library, the blue light of my phone illuminating a final, irrevocable digital vault. With a steady hand and a pulse that felt like a silent countdown, I pressed confirm. The digital signature was scorched into the record. In that quiet second, I funneled the entire multi-million-dollar inheritance into a private trust they couldn't penetrate. The next morning, the Pacific fog was thick enough to erase the horizon. I stood on the wide porch, my coffee black and cold, watching the gravel drive. A massive moving truck emerged from the whiteout, followed by my parents' sleek black car. They stepped out, wearing a kind of predatory triumph. "We've got it all organized, Maddie," my father announced, not even glancing at me as he signaled the movers toward the front door. "This house belongs to the family unit now. It's time you moved your things to the guest cottage." He didn't notice the man in the charcoal suit standing behind me, or the deputy leaning against the cedar railing. He didn't realize that in the eyes of the law, he was already a stranger at the gate. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family while everyone else took the credit? Let me know your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe boundaries are a form of self-respect, hit that subscribe button. The silence that settled over the house after that initial confrontation was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was the kind of quiet you finally notice after a loud, persistent ringing in your ears finally stops. I sat at the mahogany dining table, tracing the wood grain, and let my mind drift back to how I became the person capable of locking my own parents out of a $4,800,000 estate. I grew up as what psychologists call the invisible child. But in our house, I was more like a load-bearing beam, essential, structural, and completely unacknowledged unless the ceiling started to sag. My brother, Jordan, was the sun around which my parents orbited. I learned early on that my role was to provide the stability that allowed them to shine. When I was 12, I remember winning the regional architecture competition. I had spent 3 months building a scale model of a sustainable bridge, using toothpicks and surgical precision. When I brought the trophy home, my mother didn't even look up from Jordan's scraped knee. She told me to go get the antiseptic from the cabinet because Jordan might have an infection. The trophy sat on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks until I moved it to the garage myself. That was the recurring blueprint of my life. My achievements were minor footnotes. Jordan's minor inconveniences were national emergencies. By the time I was 17, I had been accepted into a prestigious architecture program with a full-ride scholarship. I didn't tell them for months. I knew the reaction would be a calculation of how my absence would affect their convenience. When they finally found out, they didn't celebrate. They sold my car, the one I'd bought with 3 years of saved waitress tips, to buy Jordan a professional cinema drone. My father reasoned that I wouldn't need a vehicle in the city, and Jordan needed the gear for his nascent career. He called Jordan the future of the family brand, while I was just the overhead. I didn't argue. I didn't even raise my voice. I just walked to my room and opened a fresh ledger. I realized then that my compassion had been a resource they had overdrafted for years, and the account was officially closed. I started observing them the way an architect studies a condemned building, looking for the stress fractures. I saw the cracks in their spending, the leased cars, the designer clothes they couldn't afford, and the way they looked at my grandparents' estate as a giant insurance payout. This is the hidden cost of being the responsible one in a toxic home. You learn to hide your wins because they'll be confiscated. You learn to hide your plans because they'll be sabotaged. I became a fixer who never asked for help. Not because I was strong, but because I knew the rescue party wasn't coming. I was the silent partner in their version of a family, footing the emotional bill while they lived in a fantasy. But silence isn't just submission. It's a period of preparation. While Jordan was trashing the garage for viral content, I was in the library, auditing the specific terms of my grandparents' trust. I knew that on my 18th birthday, the power would shift. I didn't need them to see me. I just needed them to stay exactly as they were, arrogant and completely unaware that the background noise was about to become the only voice in the room. The coastal estate wasn't just a piece of real estate to me. It was a museum of the only genuine love I'd ever known. It was built of old-growth cedar and local stone, anchored into the cliffs of the Oregon coast. While my parents saw square footage and potential Airbnb revenue, I saw the calluses on my grandfather's hands. During the summers, my parents deemed me too difficult or too quiet to take on their luxury vacations to the Mediterranean. They would drop me off at Sierra Ridge. My grandfather was a man who spoke in sentences as sturdy as the houses he built. He didn't treat me like an unwanted guest or a social obligation. He treated me like an apprentice. He was the one who handed me my first drafting pencil and showed me how to read the integrity of a structure. He taught me about the grain of the wood, the curing of concrete, and the importance of a level foundation. He told me that a house is only as good as the honesty of the materials. He said if the wood is rotten at the core, it doesn't matter how much gold leaf you slap on the trim. He was talking about the house, but he was looking at my father and Uncle Jeffrey. I remember one afternoon, shortly before his health began to fail, I found him in the workshop. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and linseed oil. He was painstakingly hand-sanding a piece of reclaimed oak, his movements slow and deliberate. Uncle Jeffrey had just left after a visit that was really just a thinly veiled interrogation about inheritance taxes and asset liquidation. Jeffrey had even brought a digital camera, snapping photos of the antique furniture like he was cataloging an estate sale before the owner was even cold. Grandfather didn't look up when I entered. He just kept sanding. He told me there are two types of people in this world: builders and scavengers. Builders look at a forest and see a shelter for the next 3 generations. Scavengers look at a forest and see a pile of lumber they can sell before sunset. He stopped then, his eyes meeting mine with a clarity that stung. He told me my parents had forgotten how to build, that they only knew how to consume. He told me that the land would one day be mine, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. As the months passed and his breath grew shorter, the contrast became agonizing. I would sit by his bed in the quiet of the evening, reading him architectural journals or the works of Frank Lloyd Wright, while in the hallway, I could hear my mother and Jeffrey arguing over which walls they'd knock down to create an open-concept studio for Jordan's filming. They spoke about his death, as if it were a closing date on a mortgage. Jeffrey started bringing a tape measure to Sunday dinners. He'd smirk at me, telling me to keep my room tidy because the house needed to show well when the time came. They thought I was just a grieving girl, a non-factor in their grand plan. They didn't realize I was recording every word, every plan, and every greedy calculation. I was learning the physics of their rot. I realized that if I didn't act, the house and the legacy of the man who built it would be demolished by people who didn't know the difference between a load-bearing beam and a decorative molding. The morning my grandfather passed, the mist over the ocean was so thick you couldn't see where the cliffs ended and the sky began. My father's first phone call wasn't to a funeral home. It was to a high-end real estate agent specializing in coastal luxury. That was the moment the sadness in my chest crystallized into something structural. I stopped being a granddaughter, and I started being an architect of my own destiny. I was going to build a wall they could never climb over. The air in the house was suffocating after the funeral. My parents and Uncle Jeffrey didn't even wait for the flowers to wilt before they turned the dining room into a makeshift war room. They were drinking expensive scotch and spreading architectural renderings across the mahogany table, renderings that featured a massive infinity pool where my grandfather's rock garden used to be. They wanted to strip the character out of the house to make it marketable. Jeffrey said they needed to move fast because the market was peaking. He told me I needed to pack up the workshop because they were turning it into a home gym and wellness suite. I stood in the doorway, unnoticed. They were treating the estate like a lottery win. It was then I realized that love, in their eyes, was just another contract, one they intended to breach. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family for 18 years, but the dividends were only ever neglect. That afternoon, I drove into town to see Jonathan Rice. The law office smelled of old paper and leather, a sanctuary of facts in a world of lies. I handed him the original trust documents my grandfather had slipped to me months before he passed. Jonathan looked at me over his spectacles and told me that if I moved forward with the irrevocable trust, I was effectively building a legal wall between myself and my parents. He warned me there was no undo button once the birthday passed. I sat there, looking at my hands, the same hands that had helped my grandfather plane cedar and set stone. To the outside world, it might look like a betrayal of blood, but blood had been an overdrafted account for a long time. This is the illusion people rarely talk about. The idea that family blood ties are an unbreakable bond. In reality, loyalty is a choice, and stewardship is earned. My parents hadn't earned this house. They had merely outlived the man who built it. They viewed the land as a commodity, while I viewed it as a commitment. I told Jonathan I wasn't betraying them. I was protecting the only thing that was ever real. They wanted to liquidate a legacy to pay for Jordan's followers and my father's failed investments. I wanted to preserve it. I signed the preliminary paperwork that day. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of accounting. I was auditing my life and realizing I owed them $0. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game with my grandfather's life's work, they were going to find out that the girl they ignored had learned exactly how to build a fortress. Inside, a different kind of sunrise was beginning to glow, the kind made of cold facts and quiet retribution. I walked out of that office and drove back to the ridge, watching the waves hit the cliffs. For the first time, I wasn't just a tenant in my own life. I was the owner of the ground I stood on. The roar of the Pacific usually brought me peace, but that morning, the sound felt like a war drum. I stood on the wide cedar porch, my fingers steady as I gripped my coffee mug. The moving truck sat idling in the driveway, ready to swallow my grandfather's life. Uncle Jeffrey stepped forward, waving a thick manila envelope like a trophy. He told me the deed was notarized and the title was transferred. He said the private lender had already wired the first installment of the construction loan. My mother, Jennifer, stepped up beside him, her eyes scanning the house with a cold hunger. She told me they were going to be reasonable and that they had packed my essentials. She said I could stay in the guest cottage, but the main house belonged to them now. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just looked at my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was too busy looking at the sold sign Jeffrey had brought along to hammer into the lawn. Behind me, the door opened, and Jonathan Rice stepped out, followed by Deputy Miller. Jonathan held out a hand for the envelope. Jeffrey's grin faltered, but he handed it over with a shrug of arrogance. Jonathan pulled out the deed, adjusting his glasses. The silence was absolute. He looked at the signature on the final page, my grandfather's signature, and then he looked at Uncle Jeffrey. He pointed out that the document was dated 3 days before my grandfather passed away. He told Jeffrey that he had been with my grandfather that entire afternoon and that the man was barely conscious, let alone capable of signing a property transfer. He then revealed that the notary stamp belonged to a firm that was shut down for fraud 2 years ago. The blood drained from Jeffrey's face. My father finally looked up, his jaw dropping. He asked what was happening, insisting it was a legal deed. Jonathan replied that it was a felony, it was a forged instrument. And more importantly, he had a report from a forensic accountant. Jeffrey hadn't just faked the deed, he had used it to secure a $500,000 private loan and had already spent nearly half of it on his own debts. I looked at my parents. They had been so blinded by the easy money that they hadn't even checked if their own brother was robbing them. They were so eager to push me out that they invited a wolf into their home. Anger wasn't loud. It was clinical. It was the realization that the people who raised me were willing to build their future on a foundation of theft. I watched Deputy Miller take a step toward Jeffrey. The communal future they had toasted to was crumbling in real time. Right there on the gravel, the atmosphere on the driveway shifted from a celebration to a crime scene. Uncle Jeffrey looked sickly as the sheriff stepped closer. My father stammered that he didn't know, claiming Jeffrey told him the paperwork was handled. Deputy Miller told him that forging a dead man's signature and stealing $500,000 wasn't a formality, it was a crime. I watched them scramble. It was fascinating to see how quickly family loyalty dissolved when the handcuffs came out. My mother immediately turned on Jeffrey, screaming that he had ruined everything and that they were supposed to be building a future for Jordan. Jordan was still holding his phone, but the smug energy was gone. He looked around at the moving crew who were already dropping boxes back onto the gravel and realized his audience was watching his life collapse in high definition. He started to cry, asking me to tell them they didn't know. I looked at him, then at my parents. I told them I wasn't letting anyone take the house because you can't take what you don't own. I told them I'd already finalized the irrevocable trust. This property was legally protected. They weren't losing the house today. They were being evicted from it. My mother gasped, calling me ridiculous and reminding me they raised me. I told her they raised the background noise. I told her they raised a ghost who paid the property taxes while they plotted to sell her legacy. I said they didn't want a daughter. They wanted a silent investor. I told them the audit was over, and they were bankrupt. I turned to Deputy Miller and filed a formal trespass warning. I gave them 1 hour to remove their personal belongings. My father begged, asking where they were supposed to go. I didn't answer. I just handed my mother a pre-drafted legal notice and a copy of the new security codes. Then, I turned my back. I walked up the porch steps, past the movers who were now scurrying to put my grandfather's furniture back where it belonged. As I reached the front door, I stopped and looked back. I told Jeffrey the sheriff had a car waiting for him. I told the rest of them that the fog was lifting and they should find their way out before it cleared. I stepped inside and closed the heavy cedar door. For the first time in my life, I heard the lock click, and I knew exactly who held the key. The silence at Sierra Ridge is different now. It's no longer the suffocating silence of things left unsaid. It's the quiet of a house that has finally been cleared of its rot. It has been 6 months since that morning. The court proceedings were swift. Uncle Jeffrey is currently serving time for title fraud and embezzlement. My parents are living in a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of town, their credit scores incinerated. Jordan's career didn't survive the viral footage of our eviction, turns out. Audiences don't have much sympathy for a golden child whose lifestyle was built on a forgery. I stand on the deck now, watching the morning mist lift. In my hand isn't a coffee mug, but a set of blueprints for a new sustainable housing project I'm designing. I've realized that protecting what matters sometimes means releasing the people who don't value it the same way. We're taught that blood is the ultimate bond, but that's a dangerous lie. True family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build through consistent actions and shared respect. Setting boundaries with my parents wasn't an act of rejection, it was an act of self-respect. It was the moment I stopped being a victim of their expectations and started being the architect of my own life. If you're facing similar pressures, inheritance disputes, or the crushing weight of being the invisible one, know that standing firm doesn't make you cruel. It makes you autonomous. It opens up room for authentic connections with people who actually see you. I look out over the land, feeling a peace that is rooted in the truth. I've learned that a legacy isn't just about property, it's about the integrity of the person holding the keys. I've found my level. And for the first time in my life, the view is perfectly clear. If you've ever had to build your own fortress to survive your family, know that you aren't alone. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength, and share this with someone who needs the courage to stand firm today.